And
Perfect. So we can make a start. So thank you so much, Sandra, for agreeing to present. We have Sandra Sequeira from London School of Economics going to talk about roots of political divide in the US. Sandra, it's total of 1 hour, so maybe sort of 50 minutes of presentation. And if somebody has any questions, hope you're okay if they interrupt.
yes,
Give this
absolutely.
Okay. And then this is being recorded as usual, and it will be available on the GLO website. Okay, over to you. And if anybody has any questions, please unmute your microphone. But other than that, keep it muted, please. Right, over to you, Sandra.
Okay, well, thank you so much for the invitation to be here. So indeed, today I'm going to talk about zero-sum thinking and the roots of US political divides. And this is joint work with Sahil Chinoy, Nathan Nunn, and Stefanie Stantcheva. So zero-sum thinking is the belief that the gains of an individual or group come at the expense of others. We traced some of this thinking applied to the social sciences to an anthropologist, George Foster, in the 1960s, who talked about this image of a limited good. And he used it to try to explain the worldview of small-scale pre-industrial societies that were often trying to cope with scarce resources and situations of low growth. So in these settings, indeed, for some to gain, others must lose, and the world was perhaps correctly perceived as being very zero-sum. Now, there's increasing evidence that this type of mindset can apply to many different environments worldwide. And so what we try to do with this paper is to see how zero-sum thinking can help us better understand some of the political and policy dynamics in the context of the United States. Now, to some extent, we're also going to try to look at the impact of zero-sum thinking in other countries. So I'll talk about external validity throughout the talk today. So when we just take a cursory look at the media in the US, we see that there are many different types of discourse that reflect or that are underpinned by this notion of zero-sum thinking. So here on the left, we have headlines that talk about extreme wealth does not cause extreme poverty. We think about Steve Jobs or Bill Gates as enlarging the pie, so being very positive sum in their contribution to the economy. On the right-hand side here, we have the opposite view, so a much more zero-sum view where every billionaire is viewed as a policy failure, or perhaps, to put it even more starkly, that record profits are unpaid wages. Okay, so these kind of type mindsets or views of society and the world more broadly are kind of coexisting in the US. So the question that we're going to try to ask is, how important are these worldviews? So the zero-sum thinking explain differences in views about policy, and in particular, we're going to focus on what we think are 4 key domains in which zero-sum thinking can have an impact. So one is people's support for government redistribution. The second one is support for affirmative action, policies promoting gender equality, or immigration policy. So all of these policy domains are core domains where one can think about some gaining at the expense of others. Then in the second part of the talk, I'm going to try to understand. So once we've looked at the prevalence, the incidence of zero-sum thinking across the US, documenting that, we're going to try to understand where these differences in zero-sum thinking come from. Here we're going to focus not only on individuals' own experiences, but also the experiences of their ancestors, so their parents and their grandparents. And for each generation, we're going to try to measure, again, their direct experience, but also the characteristics of the locations in which they resided in and how that may have shaped their worldviews. And to do so, we're going to focus on what we think are 3 key aspects of US history. The first one is this notion of the American dream, so economic mobility, where everyone with effort can make it in life. And so we're going to try to think about your experience or your exposure to economic mobility and how that may have shaped your view of the world. We're going to think about immigration as well. So it's often considered the land of immigrants, and so how your direct or indirect experience with exposure to immigration can shape your worldviews. And lastly, we're going to talk about enslavement. So this is obviously the legacy of enslavement is something that is hard to get around in the context of US history. And so we're going to think about how enslavement, being a very zero-sum or perhaps even negative-sum type of arrangement, how it may have shaped people's views in the long run. So let me tell you a bit more about the data that we're going to use. Let me just try to remove this floating. Yes, okay, so that's better. So for this study, we're going to design and implement a large-scale survey. It took about 7 waves to complete. It was completed online between October 2020 and July 2023. It comes from what we think is a representative sample of individuals online. Bear in mind that usually these samples with online surveys, we tend to not get the extremes, so the very rich and the very poor, but on average, when we look at the characteristics of the US population, we're not too far off with everyone in the middle. So we have a sample of about over 20,000 individuals. The survey took about 20 to 30 minutes to be implemented. And we started by asking questions about the respondents' background. So a host of demographic questions on gender, age, household income, race, immigration history, education, employment, several questions on political views, so party affiliation, voting record. Importantly, to try to get at the impact of ancestry, we designed a module that captured information on the demographics of parents and grandparents. We ask also about their residence, so which counties were they living in throughout their lives, their experience with immigration, their experience with enslavement, and also perceptions of relative income at the time the parents and the grandparents were growing up. So obviously when we ask about the grandparents, we're also getting information on the great-grandparents, so we can go as far as about 4 waves. And this is obviously what we think an improvement relative to how we usually think about ancestry when we need to use proxies such as ethnicity or country of origin, which are obviously much coarser than having actually people's experience. We then have a module with policy views. So here we ask questions about perceptions of fairness and mobility, people's views about redistribution, so desired levels of government intervention for income inequality, fairness of taxes by income status as well, and several questions about just attitudes towards government and political issues, things like trust in government, amongst others. And then we develop a module to try to capture the zero-sum mindset. So let me tell you a bit more about how we measure zero-sum. So here we try to elicit beliefs in zero-sum relations between the following groups. So again, we pick 4 domains that we think are fundamental to try to understand social and economic relations. And we look at relationships between ethnic groups. So we ask questions in the United States. There are many different ethnic groups. If one ethnic group becomes richer, this generally comes at the expense of other groups in the country. So it's framed in zero-sum terms. We ask a similar question pitting immigrants against non-immigrants. Also, we ask about countries. So in international trade, if one country makes more money, then it's generally the case that the other country makes less money. And between income groups. So there are many different income classes. If one group becomes wealthier, it's usually the case that it comes at the expense of other groups. And then we just have a Likert scale on whether people strongly disagree or strongly agree. So let me show you the distribution. This is just the raw data. This is distribution of zero-sum beliefs. So we see that across the 4 domains, we have a fairly bell-shaped distribution. So there's a lot of variation in zero-sum thinking when it comes to ethnicity, when it comes to citizenship, so immigrants versus non-immigrants. Perhaps in trade here, it's where people are a bit more indifferent, so they will tend to answer more. The modal answer is going to be 3, which is we're kind of indifferent. We're not sure if this is true, that trade is very zero-sum. perhaps not surprisingly, but when it comes to income, citizenship, and ethnicity, we see a widespread and a distribution of views. Then the first thing, and I'm going to spend more time talking about this, is how this all relates to partisanship, is to map this into political affiliations. So looking at how Democrats and Republicans view these different issues. And perhaps according to our priors, we see that Republicans tend to be a bit more zero-sum when it comes to citizenship issues, so immigrants versus non-immigrants versus natives, and Democrats tend to be much more zero-sum when it comes to income.
Sandra, just a quick question.
Yes.
In these kind
Yes.
of surveys, does it matter the way you ask the question?
Well, so we tried different wordings of the question. So one concern that we had was with what is often called acquiescence bias in surveys. So you just tend to agree with anything the enumerator, or in this case, the online survey, is going to ask you. And so we also had a different wording where we had two statements looking at the extremes of zero-sum. So one very zero-sum, the other one not zero-sum at all. And we asked, with which statement do you agree the most? And so this gets around this acquiescence bias, and so we find that the results are very similar regardless of the wording of the question that we ask. Now, perhaps what you're trying to get at, and that's a good segue for this next slide, is to think about these four domains. And so why do we ask these four domains? Well, mostly because we want to avoid that our index of zero-sum thinking is driven by a particular political set of issues. So we don't want to just focus on ethnicity. We don't want to just focus on citizenship or on income. What we're trying to look for is what is the underlying common factor or common belief that explains how you view all these different fundamental social and economic relations in society. And so in order to get at that, we use principal component analysis. And so here we have our first principal component, which will become our zero-sum score for the rest of the analysis. And as you can see, we have, the factor loadings are all high. They all are positive. They go in the same direction with a relatively large eigenvalue. And so what this is suggesting is that this score can indeed capture this common underlying factor that explains zero-sum thinking. Now, we tried to validate this question with some what we call real stakes questions. So we had some incentivized questions where people would get additional remuneration from guessing correctly the zero-sum thinking of other respondents. We also asked about whether people were willing to donate some of the remuneration that they got from the survey to a cause that would advance racial justice. And we find that those who are more willing to donate are also the ones who are a bit more zero-sum when it comes to racial relationships and who are more supportive of affirmative action. So that, again, falls in line with a truthful elicitation of this zero-sum view of the world. And lastly, we ask also whether people are willing to sign a petition to increase tax on the rich. And again, we find that those who are more zero-sum, this will become clearer when I get to the policy correlations, but that they tend to also be more willing to sign this petition to tax the rich. So this is how we try to kind of validate these questions and to make sure that we're really capturing how people are viewing these economic relations. I'll just give you a sense of descriptively what we found in terms of the correlation of zero-sum thinking with important, perhaps important domains such as geographic location. So as you can see here, we have significant variation across the US, across all the different states. We have some states that are surprisingly not zero-sum, so such as Utah. We have others that are much more zero-sum, such as Delaware or New York. But what is important here is that we don't find a specific clustering that which suggests that we're picking up something that is correlated with geographic characteristics. So there's a wide distribution of zero-sum thinking across the US. When it comes to other characteristics, we find, again, this is just descriptively, we find that if you live in an urban setting, you are more likely to be zero-sum. Perhaps competition for resources is more salient in these type of settings relative to rural areas. We find that on average, lower levels of education tend to be associated with more zero-sum thinking, with the exception perhaps of postgraduate here. So this was a bit of a puzzling result. It's not the most robust result we have once we include other demographic controls. So this is just the raw data. But we do find that the postgraduate, perhaps because it's an environment that is much more competitive, that we find also a correlation with more zero-sum thinking. And overall, with income, we also tend to see that if you have lower income, you tend to be more zero-sum. Okay, but this is just descriptively what we find in the data. Now, importantly, and again, I'll return to this issue of partisanship throughout. A key question is, are we just picking up partisan rhetoric? So is it that the Democrats tend to be more zero-sum, and therefore, if you're a Democrat, you tend to respond to these type of rhetoric, and therefore, this is how you construct your view of the world? We do find indeed that Democrats tend to be, on average, more zero-sum in their thinking. But what is striking from this graph is that there's a significant overlap across the parties. So there's a lot of within-party variation in zero-sum thinking, which we think is one way of explaining the significant heterogeneity in policy positions that exist even within party, that has been increasingly documented in recent years by political scientists. Yeah.
Did you ask about religion? I mean, in terms of how religious they are?
Yes, we did. So that's a great question. We did ask other core beliefs. So whether you think that luck is more important than effort, how religious you are, the importance of tradition. So all the types of core beliefs that could perhaps be correlated with zero-sum thinking and then be correlated with policy attitudes as well. And I'll show you in a couple of slides, but when we include these other beliefs, it doesn't change the explanatory power of our coefficient on zero-sum thinking. So let me maybe map out some conceptual links before getting deeper into the analysis and some of the results. So through which channels could we conceptualize the relationship between zero-sum thinking and policy views? So one possibility is that people are thinking about policy as a way of correcting externalities. So when you have a zero-sum interaction across group, it means that one group is going to impose a negative externality on another one. And therefore, this is economics 101, there's a justification for government to intervene. So there should be policies set into place, namely redistributive policies, that should correct this. The other concern that people may have is with procedural fairness. So people tend to care about the process through which income or wealth has been achieved, specifically if it has come at the expense of others. So both of these concerns might depend obviously on whether it is an advantaged group, so if it's the higher income, or a disadvantaged group that loses from this zero-sum interaction. And then lastly, people may be thinking about the world in purely self-interested ways. So people's views may differ depending on whether they are part of the group that is benefiting or losing from this zero-sum interaction. Let's look now at this correlation between zero-sum thinking and policy views. So here on the left side of the graph, we have our first principal component of our 4 zero-sum questions. We have different coefficients depending on whether we just have some baseline, so without controls estimate, once we introduce demographic controls, including income, including education, gender, race. And then lastly, once we include this set of alternative beliefs that I just mentioned, so belief in trust versus luck as being the key to advancement in life, or importance of tradition, or importance of religion, and so on. So that will be the coefficient that includes, that is a bit more restrictive, where we include all these additional controls. And then here we have the pro-redistribution index. So this is the traditional index that just aggregates all our questions about redistribution, and it is scaled in a way and oriented in a way that it suggests more support for redistribution. Then we have a race attitudes index that is trying to capture whether people are aware of racism in the US, whether they're aware of certain racial groups being discriminated against, and how supportive they are of affirmative action to correct some of these problems. We have a similar index for gender. So again, going in the same direction, that it increases with awareness of discrimination against women and with support for affirmative action. And then we have lastly the anti-immigration index. So this is an index that captures questions of, do you think the US should take fewer immigrants in the future? So trying to capture perceptions about the importance of restrictive immigration policies. So what we see here is that across the board, regardless of the number of controls that we include, that by and large, being more zero-sum in your thinking tends to be associated with support for redistribution, perhaps a try to correct the outcome of these zero-sum interactions in the economy. You're more supportive of affirmative action when it comes to race. You're more supportive of affirmative action when it comes to women. But on the other hand, you're also more supportive of anti-immigration policies, okay? Precisely because you view the world in zero-sum terms, and so you see the gains of the immigrants coming at the expense of the natives. Here on the right-hand side, we have exactly the same analysis, but in our zero-sum score, what we do is we remove for each of these domains the domain that might be mechanically linked to the outcome. So for instance, when it comes to redistribution, we remove the income domain. When it comes to race, we remove the ethnicity domain. When it comes to immigration, we remove the citizenship domain, so that we make sure that, again, this correlation is not driven by just one particular domain in one set of issues. And again, well, of course, the coefficients are now smaller. They're by and large going in the same direction. Okay. So an important question that was already raised is, are we picking up some other beliefs that have already been studied in the literature and for which we have already established some links as well to attitudes towards redistribution and other types of preferences? And so we include a host of questions to try to control and account for these beliefs, such as, is luck more important than effort to get ahead in life? Perceived mobility in the US, the moral universalism measures that Bernanke and others have been using, the importance of tradition, generalized trust in government. Perhaps that's going to mediate how much you believe in the effectiveness of redistribution. So we want to make sure that we control for that as well, and the importance of religion. And so what we have here is a simple, just Gelbach decomposition that tries to show how much of the effect is explained by these other beliefs. And again, we see that it varies across the four outcomes that we're interested in, but our coefficient on zero-sum thinking remains sizable and significant, even when we include for all these other beliefs. So this is just to give you a sense of how the different types of beliefs can explain the correlations that we observe with these four outcomes. Okay. So one of the conceptual links that I alluded to a couple of slides ago is this idea that people will answer these questions having primarily their self-interest in mind. So what we do here is interact our zero-sum index, looking at our three key outcomes, and we interact it with certain characteristics. So when it comes to pro-redistribution, perhaps if you're more zero-sum but you are high income, then you don't want to support redistribution because that will hurt you, right? So that's the hypothesis that we test here with all the different income brackets. And what we find is, in fact, no evidence of that. So we see that being more zero-sum but being more high income actually leads to more support for pro-redistribution. When we look at the gender index, we try to see what is the relationship between being zero-sum and being a male. And what we find is that it's the males who are most zero-sum that tend to be the most supportive of affirmative action when it comes to gender. And similarly, it's the whites who are more zero-sum that tend to be more supportive of affirmative action when it comes to race. So what this is suggesting is, again, that people are not necessarily using their own self-interest when they're answering these questions, at least based on these observable characteristics, that they are pretty much acting against their self-interest in many occasions. And so while of course we cannot firmly establish exactly what mechanism is driving these links between zero-sum in policy views, this evidence suggests that perhaps the story is more consistent with the externality correction and concerns with procedural fairness than it is purely explained by self-interest.
So is there any scope for kind of zero-sum male and white interaction?
Yes. So when we do that, we find that it's also positive, but the coefficient is much smaller.
Okay.
But there is that interaction as well.
Okay. Thanks.
Yes. Perhaps now is a good time to try to talk a little bit about external validity. So obviously, we wanted to look at these concepts in the context of the US, but we also wanted to get a sense of, is this just because the US has a particular economic and social setting? And so is this very just specific to a single country? So what we tried to do to get a flavor of this more globally is to rely on the World Value Survey that has information for approximately 192,000 respondents coming from 72 countries. And they do ask a question that is very strongly worded as what we think, capturing zero-sum thinking. So respondents are given two opposing statements and asked to choose a point on a 10-point scale that best summarizes their views. So either people can only get rich at the expense of others, or wealth can grow. So the positive sum story of enlarging the pie so that there's enough for everyone. So what we do is we ask this question in our survey as well. So to validate, to see if we find a strong correlation between our zero-sum score and this particular question in the World Value Surveys. And we do find that the relationship is positive. It's not perfect correlation. Again, we think that our measure is better at and less noisy at capturing zero-sum thinking, but we do find a positive correlation nonetheless. And so that gives us or lends some support to this strategy of using this question to see what are the relationships between zero-sum and political leanings and policy support as well in a broader set of countries. So we start by just looking at zero-sum thinking and political views across the world. And this is, again, relying on the 72 countries in the World Value Survey. And we have here on the Y scale, a political scale where you're more left to more right-leaning in your views. And then we have our index of zeros, not our index, the World Value Survey index on zero-sum thinking. And consistent with what we found in the US, we see that more zero-sum thinking tends to be correlated with more left-leaning policies. We do several robustness checks, namely looking at countries where there is a more stable and a clearer left-right distinction in the last 40 years. Obviously, we want to make sure that that's what we're capturing when we look at left-leaning political stances, and the results are very similar. So we do find this correlation exactly like we find in the US. We then try to look at policy outcomes as well. And here we're, again, a bit more limited. We don't have exactly the questions that we ask in the US, but these are fairly good proxies. So we have a question on whether respondents believe that incomes should be more equal, whether government should take more responsibility to provide for everyone, whether government should prohibit immigrants, so this anti-immigration stance, and whether people do not want immigrant neighbors. And so here we replicate our analysis now for the 72 countries. And again, with baseline, so no controls baseline model, including demographics, and then demographics plus the core beliefs. And we find a picture that is very similar to what we found in the US. So respondents in these 72 countries who are more zero-sum in their thinking tend to be more pro-redistribution as well, and tend to be more anti-immigrant as well, or tend to support, rather, policies that are more restrictive when it comes to immigration. So this gives us a sense that perhaps it's not a phenomenon that is exclusively applied to the US. So I've mentioned already that this issue of partisanship is quite important, given a lot of the rhetoric of the different parties in terms of when it comes to making zero-sum arguments. And so one thing that we wanted to analyze in more depth is based on that initial graph that I showed you with the overlap of zero-sum thinking across Democrats and Republicans, to see, can zero-sum thinking actually explain a lot of the within-party variation in policy attitudes that, as I mentioned, have been increasingly documented in recent years. And so the examples that we're going to look at is, for instance, Republicans who support government redistribution. So can zero-sum thinking help us understand this within-party variation? So here, looking at our pro-redistribution index, we're just zooming into Republicans, and we look at our zero-sum intensity, okay, and our score, and we focus on those who consider themselves to be moderate Republicans or strong Republicans. And we find a strong correlation between being more zero-sum in their thinking and being more pro-redistribution. So this is just within the Republican Party.
These are
When we look at another, yes,
these are people identifying themselves if they
self-identified. Yes,
moderate.
yes,
Okay.
yes. That's a good point. So it's completely self-identified. We can validate and restrict it a bit further, but just based on voting patterns. So we do ask who they voted for in the last elections, and so we can validate based on that. But again, it's just self-reported. So another highly contested issue when it comes to redistribution is access to universal health care. And we often think about the Republican Party as opposing universal health care. Well, what we find in our data is that for those who are most zero-sum within the Republican Party, actually tend to support universal health care. So similar to the previous result on just redistribution in general, here we also find significant variation within the Republican Party, and that variation seems to be correlated with this worldview of thinking that the economy is a set of zero-sum games. Similarly, when we look at Democrats, we try to see which Democrats voted for Trump in 2016. Trump was well known for having a very zero-sum rhetoric when it came to immigration, when it came to trade. And so what we find here, perhaps unsurprisingly, is that amongst those who identify as being moderate Democrats or strong Democrats, it's those who are most zero-sum in their thinking that were most likely to vote for Trump as well. So perhaps his message resonated the most with this group. So now to transition between the first part of the paper, where we simply try to measure zero-sum thinking, we try to correlate it with individual characteristics, we try to understand how does this have an impact on how people support different but important policies. One puzzle that we had is, and I think this is something that we've had in economics and political science for a while, is how certain groups tend to favor policies that go against their own economic self-interest. So, for instance, the young tend to be very supportive of government programs, even though they are the ones who will be bearing most of the cost of these programs, whereas the elderly tend to dislike government redistribution, even though they would benefit the most from current support and would bear less of the future costs. And so we try to understand whether this could be explained, at least partially, by people's worldviews, namely how zero-sum they are in their thinking. So one possibility is that the young tend to view the world in very zero-sum terms, and therefore are more supportive of government intervention, whereas the elderly tend to view the world in more positive-sum ways, and therefore they tend to dislike government redistribution. So then that just begs the question of where do these different views of the world come from? And so here we'll just do a very kind of high-level correlation between experienced economic growth and economic mobility and people's views of the world today. Okay. So we know from existing literature that the US has had in the past exceptionally high rates of economic mobility. Now, these rates have been coming down, have declined steadily since the 1940s. And we know that economic growth for the bottom 50% particular, and that what drives this drop in mobility, has also declined. And so when we overlap, looking here at different birth cohorts from the 1940s until the 2000s, and we look at just percentage change in bottom 50% of income. This is just to avoid the increase, the exponential increase on the 1%, on the top 1%. So we're just looking at the bottom of the distribution. But we see the percentage change in bottom 50%, and we see how it has steadily declined since the 1940s. And when we overlay this with the zero-sum index for the different cohorts from 1940 to 2000, we see the opposite relationship. So what this tends to suggest is that if you grew up in an era of relative abundance or economic growth and economic mobility, that you tend to be less zero-sum today. But as this economic mobility and growth declined, that these subsequent generations ended up being more zero-sum in their thinking. Now, of course, here we can, with this particular analysis, we can distinguish between what are age effects and what are cohort effects. And so in order to get at this question, we turn again to the World Value Survey, where here we have a panel. And so here we can account for birth year fixed effects, country by way fixed effects, and we can do a similar analysis of looking at the first 20 years of each respondent's life, and we calculate what was the GDP per capita growth in their country. Okay, so this is birth year GDP per capita growth. And we try to correlate that with zero-sum thinking. And so here perhaps it becomes, again, clear that if you experienced limited growth in your early years, that you tend to be more zero-sum today in your worldviews compared to others who grew up in an era of, or a decade of economic growth. Okay, so here, this analysis already allows us to distinguish between what is just an age effect and what is really a cohort effect and the experience of these different cohorts. Okay, so this led us to think about people's experiences and how this could explain a lot of this variation that we observe today in zero-sum thinking across the US. And so how I mentioned earlier, we're going to focus on what we think are three key factors in the history of the US: the economic mobility, immigration, and the issues related to race and enslavement. So starting with economic mobility, I think here the conceptual motivation is clear. So if you live in a period of economic stagnation, it is very salient to you that one can only gain at the expense of others. You view the world as being very zero-sum. If you, on the other hand, experience economic growth and economic mobility, then you perhaps think that the world is one where everyone can be made better off. And so to try to get at this, we try to measure economic mobility of the different generations. So we start by eliciting what was the relative economic standing amongst families at their time. We asked the respondents, so right now, compared with other families in America, would you say your own household income is far below average, all the way to far above average? Then we ask about their parents. So when you were growing up, between the ages of 7 to 17, how did the income of the household income of your parents compare to the household income of other American families at the time, and similarly for grandparents and great-grandparents. And then we simply compute this upward mobility score as the change in the score across all these different generations. Now, obviously here we're trying to capture perceptions, which is perhaps the most relevant measure, is how each respondent perceives their own history of economic mobility and how that shapes their views. We try to also look at perhaps more better measured or more concrete measures of mobility, looking at differences in education, completed education across the different respondents, parents, grandparents. And we also look at occupation. The results are actually quite similar when we use these other measures as well, but we stick to this one as the perception of mobility because we think it's the first order experience that is likely to shape one's views of the world. And so here, just with the raw data, we see that when we ask about parents to respondent mobility, so one generation shift in mobility, we see that those that experienced higher mobility tend to be less zero-sum in their thinking. When we look at mobility across 2 generations, the grandparents to the respondent today, that effect is still very strongly there. And also when we go as far back as the great-grandparents. So if you have a history of economic mobility in your family, then today you tend to be less zero-sum in your views of the world. So here we do, previously was just the raw data. Here we include all our demographic controls, race controls, state as well. And we obviously want to include all these different measures of your own mobility, parental mobility, grandparent mobility, precisely because otherwise, if we do it separately, we're going to have attenuation bias, because obviously these things are related across generations. And so again, this just confirms the previous results in the raw data that experiencing more mobility tends to make you less zero-sum in your views today. Next, we look at immigration. So again, with this idea that immigrants had an improved quality of life in the US, particularly for their children. In previous work, we have shown that this doesn't appear to have come at the expense of others. So immigrants tended to be better off, but also tended to make those around them better off. So counties with a higher share of immigration, of historical immigration in the US, particularly looking at the period of the age of mass migration between 1850 and 1920, that counties with more immigration tend to have grown faster, and some of these effects have persisted until today. So the question that we ask is whether having any exposure to immigration, so personal exposure to immigration, if that seems to shape your views of the world. And here we have across the different generations, so if you're a first generation immigrant, a second, third generation immigrant, or whether you don't have any links to or direct exposure to immigration, and we try to see what is the correlation with zero-sum thinking. So we find that if you are an immigrant, and the effect is strongest for the respondent, first generation immigrant tends to be much less zero-sum than all others in the same communities. We still see effects for second and third generation, but these are not as pronounced as being a first generation immigrant. Here is again including all the different controls, and once more we see that it is the respondent having immigrated that tends to have the strongest effect on people's zero-sum thinking today. Then we ask the question about indirect exposure to immigration. So perhaps it's not just whether you were an immigrant yourself, but did you grow up in a community where there were lots of immigrants, and so you saw lots of stories of rags to riches and immigrants doing quite well in the economy. And so we look at the age of mass migration between 1850 and 1920, and we compute for each county in the US the share of European immigration during this period. And then we tried to trace that to the counties where the respondents, the parents, and the grandparents were growing up. And so if a respondent is growing up or grew up in a county with a very high share of immigration during this period, we don't see much of an effect on their views of zero-sum thinking today. If we look at the parents, we also don't see much of an effect, but the effect is somewhat stronger, perhaps, when it comes to the grandparents, okay? Which is perhaps this is the group that was closest to the event as well. So we would expect this to be the group that is most affected by this exposure indirectly to immigration. So it seems like both the direct and the indirect exposure to immigration shapes one's views of the world. So the last factor that we're going to look at is the history of enslavement and racial relations, particularly in the American South. Now, chattel slavery, plantation slavery, was an extremely zero-sum form of production. Perhaps we can even say negative sum. And there's significant historical evidence that even after abolition, there were still pervasive and persistent forms of coercion, oppression, that persisted particularly in the South. And so the question that we ask is whether direct or indirect exposure to these types of events, if this has contributed to shaping zero-sum thinking. And so when we break down our zero-sum index across respondents from different ethnic groups, we find that there's a big difference between being an African American. It tends to be much more zero-sum. This is just raw data without controlling for anything else. But Black African Americans tend to be much more zero-sum in their thinking compared to all the other ethnic groups. The Asians are the ones that are least zero-sum in their thinking. There are different historical accounts that anthropologists and sociologists have put forward to try to explain this, but mostly it is that these societies tend to be rooted in much more cooperative forms of agrarian production back in the day, and so that these things have persisted and these norms have persisted amongst these groups. But what stands out really is the big racial divide across the groups. Again, this is just controlling for everything. Previously, it was just the raw data. Here, we estimate this with all the different groups, and the coefficients that I mentioned earlier stand out. So the African American versus the Asian, and here we have the Native Hawaiians as well. We then ask whether individuals had an ancestor who was enslaved. And here we left the question about enslavement. What we had in mind was indeed chattel slavery, but we did not mention that in the wording of the question. And so we did get many respondents to answer about different instances of enslavement, ranging from Japanese internment camps to war prisoners, to survivors of the Holocaust. And so the different groups interpreted enslavement differently. And here we correlate that with zero-sum thinking. And so what is striking perhaps is that for most ethnic groups, we see that there's a big difference between having an enslaved ancestor or not in your correlation with zero-sum thinking. So if you had an ancestor who was directly enslaved, you tend to be much more zero-sum in your thinking. But that difference is not as pronounced when we look at Black African Americans. Perhaps one explanation for this could be that because of more generalized forms of oppression and discrimination, particularly in the US South, that the marginal effect of having had a specific ancestor who was enslaved is much smaller for this community than for other communities and other groups. So again, this is just with all the controls, and we see pretty much these similar effects, that having an enslaved ancestor is strongly correlated with being more zero-sum in your views. So here we have just the different episodes of enslavement, as I mentioned, so the Holocaust, the war prisoners, and how people interpreted these different episodes of enslavement, and how we find this correlation with zero-sum thinking as well. So the first set of results that I just showed is about you having direct experience through your family with enslavement. Here we ask questions about if you grew up in an area, in a county that had a high share of slaves. And so very analogous to what we did with immigration, we find that respondents who grew up in counties with a higher share of slaves up to the 1860s are more zero-sum today. Parents as well, and grandparents as well. So if grandparents grew up in counties with a higher share of slaves, that tends to have been transmitted intergenerationally. And so respondents today will be more zero-sum in their views. Okay. The last thing that we do is to think about the diffusion of zero-sum thinking from the US South. And I think this can give us a window into how these perspectives and these narratives can actually diffuse, so across generations, but also across space. So there is an existing very interesting work done by Bazzi et al. And Elora Derncourt that look at the Great Migration of Black individuals from the South to other parts of the US after the Civil War, and the other Great Migration of white Southerners in the 1940s in the US. And so what we try to understand is whether, even looking outside of the southern US, counties in the North that received a higher share of either Black migrants from the South or white migrants from the South, are they more likely, people who grew up in those counties in the North, are they more likely to also view the world in zero-sum terms? And so here we have the correlations for the respondent county of where they were growing up, for the parents and for the grandparents. And again, we find that if you grew up in a county with a higher share of white Southern migrants between the 1900s to the 1940s, that you are more zero-sum in your thinking today. So you yourself did not migrate, but you grew up in a context or in an environment where people brought this worldview that was very influenced by slavery in the South, and that these effects are actually strong both for the respondent, the parents, and the grandparents. A similar analysis, the Bazzi et al. Paper, looks at this diffusion of what they call Confederate culture. And again, when we use that indicator, we find very similar patterns that line up exactly as the previous ones, that just more exposure to these types of culture and worldviews are associated with more zero-sum thinking today. So what we try to do in this paper is to ask what we think is a fundamental question of how people view economic and social relations in the economy. So do they think that gains come at the expense of others? How zero-sum is the world? We argue that this is important because how people, their implicit views of this has important implications for US politics and for US support for different policies. And we find that not only is there a lot of variation in zero-sum thinking across the US, but that can be explained by an interplay of respondents' own experience, as well as the experience of their ancestors, both direct and indirect, linked to important factors such as economic mobility, immigration, and enslavement. So thanks very much, and I'm very happy to answer more questions.
Great. Thank you, Sandra. I think Klaus has a question.
Yeah, Sandra, very, very interesting, fascinating talk. But at the end, I was a little bit confused about the general message. Why? At the beginning, I had the impression, well, zero-sum thinking is something which is unique to a person, and it explains yes or no the view of the world. On the other hand, my first reaction was, well, isn't zero-sum thinking a bit context related? It's not a view about the world in general, but about things happening in the world. Migration is a different issue than innovation or whatever. And when you went further on, you made more and more clear that all this is highly endogenous. And at the end, you showed impressively that facts are driving the views of the world. So it's the kind of Marxian thinking, yes, how the world is. The reality forms the ideology above you, yes, and that leads away from the original position that this is a unique thing which is owned by a person and is not changing.
So that's a great question. And I think that's exactly what we are thinking about for the next steps in this research agenda. I think this paper is really a proof of concept, is trying to introduce this concept of zero-sum thinking, trying to document its prevalence and how it has real implications for policy attitudes. And then we do a first foray into trying to understand how deep-rooted are these kind of cultural models and views of the world. And so what this paper shows is that a lot of it is in fact deep-rooted, that gets transmitted intergenerationally. Now, that doesn't mean that it's fixed, right? So the next steps in our research agenda is to try to understand, well, how malleable is this zero-sum concept? So it's possible, when confronted with a new challenge in the economy, when do you resort to this more deep-rooted models of the world, and when do you simply respond to cues in your environment that change the way you think about policies? So I have another paper looking at a completely different context in Africa, where I do see some malleability, is that when there's a very strong economic shock, that people do change their zero-sum views of the world relatively quickly. And so I think with the next steps in this research agenda is to try to understand exactly when do you respond by using these deep-rooted mental models, and when do you respond very quickly to changes in your environment? And it's likely to be a combination of the two. We just don't know enough about which one is going to dominate in which settings. But I think that's precisely kind of the tension that makes this so interesting, is trying to get a better sense of how do people respond to this information and their experiences vis-a-vis the cues in the environment. So I think that's exactly where we need to head with this research.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions?
Hi, sorry, I have a question.
Yeah.
So maybe relating to this, whether it's a more generalized view of the world or something more domain specific, I noticed that you post your questions in the survey really with a focus on money, on the economic dimension. I mean, for example, for ethnicity, you could have also formulated the question such that it emphasizes more the you know, the focus is more on eliminating inequality between minorities and other ethnic groups, and this could be more like if the blacks get more rights, then this comes at the expense of the whites or something like that, and less on the monetary dimension. And yeah, I was wondering if you would consider this then a different, or if you would think that then your index would maybe look different.
Yes, that's a very good question. So it is, the way we frame it is one group gains at the expense of the other. Now that could be pecuniary gains, or it could be in terms of power as well, right? So one group has more rights or more power culturally, socially, politically than the other one. So I think that the questions are still broad enough to be able to capture both. What you're suggesting is something more precise, saying that, well, that maybe people view these things differently. And so they view the economic, how the economic surplus is distributed very differently to how the cultural or political or social surplus is divided between the groups. So we did add some questions that, again, the paper is already quite long in the presentation, so we didn't add them, but we added some questions about, for instance, women's right or participation in the labor market. So in recent decades, so women have increased their participation in the labor market. Do you think that came at the expense of jobs for men? And so we asked a couple more zero-sum questions with that flavor. And when we have a broader augmented index that incorporates those questions as well, we see that the patterns are very similar. So it doesn't suggest to us that it's a purely the monetary, the pecuniary view of the transaction that is driving these responses. But again, it would be very interesting for future research to try to delve deeper into how people are thinking about these different issues. We don't have evidence that they think any differently, but it's obviously still an open question.
Thanks. And maybe if I could just ask another question on your wording. So you had this scale, strongly agree until strongly disagree. And then in the middle, I think it was like 3 is neither. How would you interpret this answer if someone answered this question as neither? So like on the one hand, there is like one ethnic group can only become richer at the expense of others and of the other ethnic group. And on the other side of it, it's that's not generally the case. So would you think somewhere in the middle is someone that thinks it depends on the situation, so it can be either both, or someone that doesn't really think that this dimension is at play at all, in like it doesn't even think in this dimension?
Right. So the neither we interpret as you don't think that it's one or the other. We did have an option as well for people to say don't know. Okay. So if you don't understand how this could be zero sum, then you can always resort to that. And we did see some people doing that as well. So it's just shows that people interpreted the question the way we think they are interpreting, which is it, and again, with the two-statement question, we get the two extremes in which one do you think you agree with the most, precisely to get around this issue of the indifferent or neither. And I think that the results are very similar when we use the two-statement question relative to this Likert scale, precisely to avoid this problem.
I mean, was there a possibility of saying don't care?
Don't care, no. That we didn't have. That we didn't have. We just assumed that that people were taking the question seriously and.
Yeah, but I mean, I'm just saying in even in taking this question seriously, it could be that it doesn't matter to me if it's, you know, redistribution or
Mhm.
not, whatever, sort of in the, I mean, I know the questions are done and stuff, but I was just thinking in
Yes.
terms of, you know, people's political kind of views. Sometimes it's just you go with the flow and you know, kind of choose one or the other.
Right.
I
So
think-
we do lots of tests, the standard tests for people's attention. So we had lots of attention questions. We excluded everyone who wasn't paying attention in our attention traps. And so we think that people were paying attention. In fact, the donation question and the petition, where the donation in particular, there were real stakes because it was their own money that was on the line for the donation, and people seem to take it seriously. But of course, this is always an issue with surveys.
Anybody else? One quick question, last one. Okay, in that case, perfect timing. Thank you so much, Sandra. That was really interesting.
And thank you so much, everyone. Thanks for the questions and the invitation.
Bye. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.